Thank you. I think everybody is taking their supper break to come to this. We can eat afterward. Yesterday, somebody asked me what I was doing in Arkansas, what I was doing in Conway at the time, and I said, oh, I'm going to give a talk at tomorrow night, and they said, about what? And I said, about Western art. And they said, what's that? And I explained a little bit. This is popping a little. Should I stay away from that? And I said, well, when they asked what it was, and I said a little bit about it, about the art of the American West. And they said, well, is that the Old West? And I said, well, yes, it's not the contemporary West. And we got into this, and I thought, I guess I better explain just a little bit for anyone who doesn't know what that definition of Western art is, because it's in times past been debated. And I've worked with it, with collections of Western art for the last 40 years, and so I just kind of take it for granted. And then I thought, oh, all right, the West. Well, of course, it is a part of the American experience. It's probably a unique part of the American experience when you get down to it. And did my mic go off? Oh, no, okay. And it is the thing that gave this country for 200 years its energy, its westward movement, the idea that the manifest destiny of this country was to go from sea to sea. And all those experiences are lost to us now, except through journals, writings, and pictures. Because we can't, you know, the past is past, but we can get some idea of it looking at the pictures. Now, I was in art school and learned early on that art was not supposed to talk about anything but art. And in this day and time, that the idea of depiction, of description, of illustration was something less than art. They felt like that art was not supposed to serve any purpose but art. Well, in the 19th century in particular, art served other purposes, to illustrate. Well, much the same that the TV camera does today, to keep us in touch with what's going on. In the 19th century, there were no cameras for the first half of the century, certainly no television, no movies. If someone went on an expedition, say, to the Rocky Mountains and left Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, they might be gone 2 or 3 years, and nobody had any idea if they got there or if they were coming back, but they would come back finally with all of these reports and all of this material that eventually might be published. Might be 10 years between the time of the expedition and the publication of the book. All of the expeditions, the early expeditions that the government sent out into the West, that the Army sent out into the West, they all included artists, which surprised people. When these expeditions would go out, they took botanists, geologists, engineers, draftsmen, map makers, artists. All these people went out because they were gathering information. They were trying to see what is it like out there, especially when we bought the Louisiana Purchase. They had no idea at all what it encompassed. They just kind of had an idea of how far it was. They didn't know what was out there or who lived there or what kind of animal life was there, nothing. So when they would send out these expeditions, artists went with them. Well, in time, especially after the Civil War, when the railroad crossed the country, and things began, you know, lots of people began going out west and it began to be settled. Then the artists came out with the newspapers. And they were illustrators, just pure and simple. What was going on out there? There were the Indian Wars. There was the discovery of gold, whatever it was. And they wanted pictures, like now they send photographers and so forth out. These artists often made their living this way and then came home and began to just paint. Some of them just painted what they had experienced. They created they created a myth, I suppose you could say, an ethos. They created an idea of the experience of the West. And you know, art is the objectification of an idea. When I was in school, they told us, now you can't just think about something. You can't just have a good idea. You have to do something with it. And so a work of art is the objectification in material form of some kind of an idea. It might even be musical. It might be visual. But this idea has to be objectified so that somebody else can see it or understand it. In other words, there's got to be a connection. So the artist in the 19th century was concerned with description, with illustration, if you would. And only later with the idea. Although people have said the idea always gets in the way of the reality. And you draw or write about things that you're interested in. And there may be lots of things going on, but you're just going to pick this or that to talk about because you can't talk about everything. The person who sees the work or hears the work understands it only insofar as their experience lets them do that. You know, if you have an experience and speak of it in a foreign tongue that no one understands, nobody knows what you're talking about. Pictures speak louder than words very often. And it was the artist in the 19th century in America that created the idea that we have today of what the American West was, what the Old West was, because it isn't this way now. I tell you, Howard Lamar at Yale wrote me some time back. He was putting together an encyclopedia of the American West, called at that time Reader's Encyclopedia of the American West. And he asked me if I would contribute some essays on Western artists. And so I thought, oh dear, well, I don't know who to, let's see, how many, shall I be representative or should I be comprehensive? Because there's a lot of artists. He said, well, of course you'll have to be representative, but be as comprehensive as possible. And so I thought, okay, that didn't help. And so I came up with a list of about 130 artists, as I recall, and he said, oh, that's way too many. This isn't an art book. He says, about half that many. So I thought, how will I, you know, it's much easier if you don't have to make a judgment, a decision, a judgment call, as they call it. It'd be a lot easier if I could just list everybody and let the reader decide. So I finally thought that I would include those artists that I thought it would be a grievous oversight not to include, and which is kind of an odd way to do it. I thought, well, he's got to be in there. Well, this one, oh, well, that's not so important. And so some of them I bunched together in group essays on the art of this or that. And anyway, the next hurdle in just this talking about the art of the West, we had to define the West. Because he had artists like Frederick Church, who was an Eastern landscape painter, but he painted in Ohio, and he painted a wonderful painting of Niagara Falls. And I said, well, that's not Western art. That's not the Old West. And so we had to define, well, what is the West? And we finally came up with, we defined the geography of the West historically and decided, okay, you got to draw a line somewhere. First, we won't have any living artists. That'll take care of some contemporary people. And mostly 19th century. And so anybody west of the Mississippi, west of St. Louis, and north of Mexico, in the 19th century, when most of that large area was explored and settled. And it will be what most people have in mind, popular idea of the horseman, the cowboy, the outlaw, the trooper, the American Indian, the buffalo, wildlife, all those things, even down to the 20th century when they were putting, the buffalo nickel It has a picture of an Indian chief on one side and a buffalo on the other. That was the idea of the West. And I think it still is today, actually. And they told me how long I could talk, and so I'm going to start showing you some slides and telling you about some of the actual artists. The lights are on. It doesn't, can you see this all right? Yeah, oh, there. Very early, the American Indian was a subject for art. When the first people came to this country, they were startled to find people here. They didn't know there were any men here, any people. And they, even in Connecticut and places like that, they'd ask them, where did you come from? And the reply would be, well, where did you come from? We've been here all this time, like the trees in the forest. So very early, people were interested in what they called natural man and the American native. And in Washington, in the early 1820s, Thomas McKinney, who was head of the Bureau of Indian Trade and later of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which was in the War Department at that time, hired an artist by the name of Charles Bird King to paint portraits of all the visitors from the western tribes who came to Washington on treaty business. And he created over 100 of these portraits, and they were later published in what was the first publication of its kind called A History of the Indian Tribes of North America. Now, in the meantime, all the originals burned up at the Smithsonian in a fire. But most of these portraits survive as hand-colored lithographs in published form. There are a few duplicates that the artist made that are in a few collections I can think of at Gilcrease for one and at the Stark Museum for another. But most of them survive as published images. Now, there were also artists who just painted mural type, I would almost say imaginary paintings that epitomized the idea of Rousseau's natural man. There was a feeling among the intelligentsia that actually people were basically good if left alone, but it's civilization that has ruined everything. So the natural man was nearer to Adam than we are, this approach. In fact, they debated for a long time whether they were human. And there was one man that came along and said, well, you know, they look like us and they act like us, so they must be. And this is an early example of a very, you know, I don't know that they ever danced on a lake like that. So I don't know. We don't know exactly where he observed that dance somewhere because the figures are doing certain things, but the composition is totally romanticized. Here is a more realistic approach. Peter Rindisbacher was not a professional artist. He was up in the Minnesota territory. He was up along the Red River of the North and in Canada. He later went to St. Louis and stayed there. He did some drawings and paintings. This was a drawing or a painting that was reproduced in McKinney & Hall, which Thomas McKinney and Judge Hall published the Charles Bird King paintings. This is actually from observation. Now, you know, there's always a jump between the observation and the report. And nothing is ever absolutely, nobody ever tells it exactly like it is. All art is subjective. Most of our approach to art is subjective. There's very little objectivity involved, although we like to think there is. I know the news media likes to pretend that they're objective about everything. Well, nobody is quite. You're going to report what interests you. But Peter Rindisbacher was one of these early artists that nobody remembers except that he happened to paint some subjects that are still of interest to us from the historical standpoint. Here's another one, Chasing the Buffalo. Early in the minds of Europe and America, was the horse and rider in buffalo. And it became a fixed icon, if you will, of the American West. Again, this is Peter Rindisbacher. George Catlin was another artist who spent about 6 years west of the Mississippi, came down into Oklahoma, went up to Minnesota. He was all over the West out there, specifically to capture the looks and conditions of the Native American and all the various tribes. This happens to be a Mandan Indian, forebears, and his wife. He is all dressed up to have his picture made, which was a common thing then. When they sat for their portraits, they put on their paint, they put on their best clothes, and the wife is holding up a buffalo hide that he has drawn on, that he has painted. That's a winter count. And so this is a staged or posed picture, but it still tells the truth about what they wore, how they dressed. It doesn't tell a lot else. It doesn't tell a lot about how they lived, but actually Catlin did in a lot of his paintings, and so did Carl Bodmer. And they cut the top off of the... Carl Bodmer went out in the 1830s, about the same time as George Catlin. George Catlin was out in the West from 1830 to 36. Bodmer was there from 32 to 34. He went up the Missouri River. He painted many of the same people that Catlin did, many of the same individuals. And he took his... He went up on a private expedition. There was a German prince who wanted to travel to the interior of North America, and they did it on the Missouri River. They came home back to Germany. Prince Maximilian published his Journal of Travels in the Interior of North America. Bodmer went back to Paris. He was actually Swiss. And reproduced, well, he produced all these paintings. He reproduced them in an atlas of pictures to go along with the publication. It was so expensive, it wasn't like books today. It wasn't like being published today. Then only libraries and princely houses and people with a lot of money could buy those books. There were no books. You didn't see them on a bookstore. There wasn't a book sale. And so it was in our time that these things have been rediscovered and looked at again and analyzed. And here we go. There was another artist of the same period. He went out just once in 1837 with a Scottish nobleman who was on a hunting trading expedition, and he decided, after having seen some of Catlin's paintings in St. Louis, that he ought to take an artist along with him. And so Sir William Drummond Stewart found Miller down in New Orleans, actually, and took him out west with him, out what later became the Oregon Trail, out across Nebraska into Wyoming. And again, he captured just a moment in our history. And these are the Indians encamped outside the fort. They're there to trade. They don't live there all the time. They come and set up camp and spend a few weeks and trade with the traders at the fort. And that's Fort Laramie, Fort William it was then. And he's the only one who ever painted Fort Laramie, the first one, because later there was an adobe fort there, and later the Army had a fort there, but that's the earliest one, 1837. And Miller's claim to fame is that he painted Western commerce, the trappers and traders, whereas both Bodmer and Catlin spent almost all their time painting the native tribes. They hardly ever painted a white man. They hardly ever painted a trapper or a trader or anybody else. Miller painted the trappers, the traders, and then spent the rest of his life in Baltimore painting portraits. And there's another Miller. That's trappers and Indians conversing by sign And I used to wonder that when I thought of all the different tribes out there, and they all spoke different languages, and then the Germans and the French and the English and everybody were also out there. And it's amazing that anybody ever knew what anybody else was talking about. But they did, not just by sign language. You would learn this tribe's language, and they would tell you what that one was because they happened to know. And that's why we come down and have some funny names for some of these people and not the same name in every case. Seth Eastman, who painted this very idyllic, very romanticized, very natural man in nature, was a military man. Actually, he taught art at West Point. And officers in those days all had to take art. They had to know how to draw because they felt like that drawing focused your mind and made you look at things more closely. And could you observe, did you notice that? If you have to draw it, you're looking at it. Now, they weren't all great artists, but they all learned to draw a map, and they all became pretty good topographical artists. I'm sure that they didn't all graduate in that school. But Seth Eastman was also stationed at various points out west, and especially, Fort Snelling. I went through 2 of them, didn't I? Oh, there it is. This happens to be, he just titled it Sioux Indians. But it's a group near Fort Snelling, and it's really quite a lovely picture just in its composition, just in looking at it. You could hang it over the fireplace, or it's not a battle scene like a lot of them. It's just a group of people getting ready to get in the boat and cross the river. He did a lot of paintings in his later life for the Capitol in Washington, D.C., for the Senate building and for the House of Representatives. He was stationed in D.C. for a good part of his life. When he was old, he was breveted brigadier general before he died. He was I think he was in the Mexican War. So he was really first an officer. He was a military man, but he was a painter. And as I say, taught art at West Point. And his wife was a writer. And she would write books on frontier subjects and on the West, and he would illustrate them. And one of the books was, a lot of people think, inspired Longfellow's poem, Song of Hiawatha. And I don't know if that's true or not, but then that's what they say. But he and his wife published widely, and then the government published a 6-volume statistical and historical report on the Indian tribes of North America in the 1850s. And he and another artist by the name of Edward Kern, illustrated that huge report. So this is what a lot of these artists did. They'd be doing reports over here and illustrations for an expedition over here, and then they'd just be painting pictures. And I don't know if they ever sold any of these like that. Now, there's another, Sully. Thomas Sully's son. And I can't think of his first name. I could say John, you wouldn't know the difference. But Sully was another military man out on the frontier. And he was more involved in the Indian Wars than Eastman was. And he was not the artist that Eastman was. His pictures are of interest only because they're descriptive. They're not particularly inspired. They're not particularly well painted. And he's just kind of very graphic. This is what they're doing, and this is kind of what they look like, and this is what they wore, and there it is. And he doesn't waste a lot of time with it. But he painted a lot of pictures, some of them almost primitive. They use that term for an untutored artist, and they say it's a primitive. And then somebody along the line said, that is kind of a rude term. And so they decided they would call them naive artists, which I think is worse. And so now, I don't know, I think they call them untutored, uninstructed. They have words for it. Meaning, in other words, some of these artists never went to school. Nobody taught them how to paint. They just learned kind of on their own. And so whether you want to call them primitive or naive or what, here's another artist who was very popular, Charles Dease. Again, he only visited the West. He really wasn't out there for any length of time. But he was also captivated, as many people were, by the works of James Fenimore Cooper. And everybody had this idea about what the West was like and what the native tribes were like and about Indian wars and all this stuff. And so this is an imaginary, it's just, the title, he didn't title it, the title's come down to us, Indian Warfare. Well, yes, it is. And it's the kind of thing that was widely published and in books. It's not great as a work of art, and it's not at all convincing as a documentary, because it's not likely that he was standing out there sketching that when it happened. But he knows anatomy, and he knows how to make a dramatic composition, and it's a convincing work in that regard. But I don't know that we should regard it as documentary. Same way with this, the same type thing. Now again, this is a peaceful scene. They're being carried across the water. They're crossing the river. It's typical of the artists of the time either painted these idyllic scenes of natural man and beautiful nature, or they painted all of these battles and fighting and bloody warfare. And probably the truth of what life was like is somewhere in between. They've seldom painted settlers. They weren't very dramatic. They weren't very interesting. They didn't paint merchants in the old frontier towns. They very seldom. They liked the cavalry. They liked the action, that kind of thing. That's what's come down to us. I put this in because this is one of the first views of the Rocky Mountains, and it was painted by an artist named Samuel Seymour, who went out with Stephen Long on his expedition to the Rockies in 1819. And the very first views of the Rockies were published by Edwin James, who was the botanist with that expedition. And it included, what, 4 or 6 engravings after Samuel Seymour. I've never seen an original of his, except for this, and cannot vouch for the fact that it is. Because we can't, when we look at something like that, we don't know if it was painted before the image was published or after. But it's still an image of some value because it's an early view of what the country was like in 1819, 1820. John McStanley had more experience out in the West than practically any of the artists, and a lot of his work was reproduced as chromolithographs in Europe. He went with one of the railroad surveys. There were 6 railroad surveys, by the way, in the 1850s to determine what was the most practical route for a transcontinental railroad. And of the 4 surveys, there were 12 different artists involved in this survey, which took several years. And John McStanley was one of the artists who prepared the reports that were published in Washington. He had a large collection that was on view at the Smithsonian in 1865 when that fire broke out that I mentioned that burned up all of Charles Bird King's pictures. Well, they burned up all his pictures. There were 5 that were not in that building that survived. So he recreated a lot of his paintings again. He recreated his whole collection again. Then a fire broke out in his studio in Detroit and burned up everything in there. And I always thought there was just like a bad something following him around. But this is something, the title is Snake in the Grass. That's the name of the man. And it was published as a chromolithograph. But you see, he's got a rifle, but yet he's all dressed up. He's certainly not dressed up in hunting clothes. They didn't put on all that stuff to go out and hunt. But he's got him all dressed up. Probably he's posed, because as a matter of fact, he did a lot of that. This is called young Chief Uncas, who's a character in one of Fenimore Cooper's stories, Last of the Mohicans. Now, this is obviously a studio pose. He used that rock, by the way. I don't know how many paintings of his. I've seen that there's that rock and people are doing things on it or around it. But this is a young man, a boy, and he has dressed him up with the paraphernalia that he happened to have and put that feathered chief's hat on his head. And he's painted this total romance, but he's done it in a very realistic manner and in a very detailed manner. And it actually, when you see the real painting, it's a beautiful painting. But it's not real. The character isn't even real. But that's all right, because the West isn't real now. Somebody said, well, the West is just a state of mind. Well, I can't get into that. But it happened. It just means different things to different people. And I don't know why he painted that. He probably painted it to sell. He may have painted it on commission. And back to Miller again. He was the first one out along what later became the Oregon Trail. He's the one who, he had been in Europe. He had studied in Paris and in Florence. And he came home and he said, oh, you know, people travel from all over the world to look at the statues at the Vatican. And right here at the foot of the Rocky Mountains are such figures that nobody has ever seen. The most beautiful men in the world. And he's talking about the Sioux and these people out there riding the horses. He thought they were just splendid. And he also said, you know, the day is coming when railroads come through the South Pass, when people will flock out here and where hotels will rise on these lakes and on the edge. And he could just imagine that the West was going to be this huge attraction. Well, he was about 30 or 40 years ahead of himself. Here is, by the way, that is Sir William Drummond Stewart, his patron. And those are his wagons behind. That's called cavalcade or caravan. He came out west to trade with the Indians, to make money, to pick up souvenirs. It was like a safari, like they used to do later in Africa. And he had hundreds of people in his employ. And they would come out across there, and of course all the Indians would set up camp and they would trade. And everything changed. There was always the argument, did the wilderness change the European settler, or did the settler change the wilderness? And some say, well, the settler conquered the wilderness because it practically disappeared. And I think there was a little bit of both, that in doing it, they changed their character and nature somewhat. So when these came out, it's kind of like Lloyd Haverly's Fatal Impact. Once they've met, once the Indians can have metal pots, they quit worrying about buffalo hide pots. Once they had nails, once they had the things that they could get in trade, they quit making things for themselves. And beads, they could get glass beads that were a lot cheaper and easier than porcupine quills. And all that you have to do to develop, you know, to make them so that you can use them for decoration. And so this is that point at which it never was the same again. And regardless of whether we think it was the bad or good or whatever, it just wasn't the same. And that was, oh, and there's setting traps for beaver. He's the only artist who ever depicted the trapper or the mountain man when he was there. Because very shortly after Miller was there, like by the 1840s, the mountain man's activities fell off. Because for one thing, the beaver hat went out of style in Europe, and there was no big market for beaver pelts. And other things happened, and so Miller caught the old mountain man, the old trapper, just at that time, just before that changed forever. So look at all that nostalgia and romance in that, see? So that's where you get a lot of this. Here's another Miller. When I see that, I always think of, He's got a journal, it's at Gilcrease, that describes about 166 of his pictures. And he just knows that tourism is going to, that the West is going to be a tourist mecca, which it finally was. Now, Albert Bierstadt was German-born, came to this country as a child, grew up here, went back to Germany to study in art. About 1858, he joined a survey out of Fort Laramie to survey a wagon road to the Pacific. And so he just went along. I don't think he was not an official artist of the expedition. He just went along. But he came back and in 1859, 1860, painted some terrific landscapes of the Rocky Mountains that he showed at the National Academy of Design. Everybody just thought they were wonderful. They elected him into the membership that year. And for about the next 20 years, he would go back to the West, and he would, in clear California, he would paint these wonderful, heart-stopping views of the Rockies with the clouds boiling over and the thunder and the thing. This is at a time when most people thought that everything west of the Mississippi was a desert or wasn't fit for human habitation. Well, I don't know that you can live in the Rocky Mountains like that, but he became one of the highest paid artists of his time. And his pictures, the Congress bought several of them and decorated the halls of government buildings with these enormous pictures. Moran, later we'll look at some of his, did the same thing. They'd have pictures as big as that, all of that curtain there. And they would sometimes have several of them in a room, and you could pay a price and come in and view them and get some idea, make you feel like you were there, because these huge landscapes around the room, almost like a diorama or a panorama. And then in about 1882, that went out of style, and people didn't buy those anymore, and people didn't know what to do with them, and they just dropped all these artists like hot rocks. And so Bierstadt didn't know what to do, and his house on the Hudson burned, and he just went into a very bad decline. His wife died, and so he thought, what am I going to do? And they would not accept any more of his paintings at the Academy, and so he began to paint animals. And he decided he was going to do like Audubon and paint all the North American animals. Well, he did do a painting called Last of the Buffalo, but it was refused in the National Exhibition. It's out at Cody, Wyoming now, but it was reproduced as a lithograph, chromolithograph. But these are just some of his animal studies, and it's hard to realize that this is the man that painted all those wonderful landscapes and those panoramic scenes that were in such demand for so long. And he ended up obscurely. It's like a lot of the artists did in the 19th century. They always have a terrible time and die in poverty and so forth. And then they're discovered 50 years later. Much good it does them. But, when we realize, oh, this man was wonderful. And so Thomas Hill is another one, although he was not as famous, and he didn't come to such a poor end. Maybe it just seems like that Bierstadt came to a bad end because he was so famous and he was decorated in Europe, and everybody just thought he was wonderful. Rani is an artist that did have experience in the West. He mostly was out in Texas and during the Mexican War, and he also was interested in horses, and he was interested in trappers and traders. And I've always liked that painting. It's called Trappers, and it's romantic. Yes, it's nostalgic. It carries you back to another time and place, but it's a beautiful painting. And the reason I say that is because a lot of times these artists come in for criticism by the fact that they were descriptive and the fact that they painted a romance, if you would, because that kind of thing has fallen out of favor right now, and we always think, no, we want to be real. And I don't know. I think that the romance was real to a lot of these artists. And then there was Worthington Whitridge, who traveled, mostly he was a Hudson River School painter. He was an Eastern painter, but he did go out west a couple of times, and when he did, he just painted landscapes. Those happened to be in Nebraska, with the faint suggestion of the Rockies in the background, if you can see it. And here are a couple more. A camp on the prairies there. Actually, that's in Kansas, and that's Nebraska. I don't know why that, from my view, it looks rippled. It doesn't. This isn't rippled here. And here's another, Charles Weimar. He was a German. He had very little experience in the West, but he did go west. And he did paint a lot of Western subjects back in Europe. And so he's considered a Western artist. Although you cannot put him in the same class with Catlin and Bodmer and people like that who were there at the time and documenting what they saw. This is a story. He's telling a story. Actually, very few of his paintings are verified. That is to say, there are a few of them in St. Louis. Most of them that are attributed to him, he probably didn't paint. And that's William Carey. This is a fort in Kansas, Fort Riley, what it looked like about just right after the Civil War. I'm told I have to go through these and leave time for questions. Oh, Currier knives. Currier knives perpetuated the American idea. There is westward the course of empire makes its way. And I have two of their prints with that title. This is the caravan on the Oregon Trail, and there are the mountains in the background, glorious to behold, and there are some native people wondering, oh boy, there goes the neighborhood. You know, they're sitting up there, and there are all these people coming in. Here it is again. Westward the course of empire. And it's the train. It's 1869. They connected the east and the west coast with the railroad out in Utah. And from then on, things happened fast. There were a number of artists that went out on the railroad. The railroad companies would hire artists. They did that into the 20th century. Hire them for free. They say, we'll give you a free ticket if you'll give us some pictures of what you see, so that we can use them for promotion, to encourage people to come west and to buy tickets and ride the train and come out here. Now, this artist actually never, probably ever saw this, but this is a popular image by another one of these naive artists. And it looks like something that you might see in an old movie, but they're still kind of fun when you find them. Here's a really odd painting by a fellow named John Dare Howland. This was a commissioned work by a rancher in Wyoming, and it's called The Western Jury. And I never talked to anyone who knows what it's about, but it's a great big painting. It's at Joslin Art Museum in Omaha. It's this very large painting. And of course the buffalo is standing around looking at this dead man down here. I don't know if there's some connection. They didn't cause his death. What is this? So anyway, this is something that was painted on commission. He painted it the way his patron the guy said, this is what I want, and so he painted it. And actually, he did look at buffalo, and there's some nice figures there, but it's kind of an odd picture, really. Remington, Frederick Remington, is probably the most famous of all the Western artists, and he was for years and years an illustrator. He went out west for the first time in 1882. By 1886, he had had 200 illustrations published back east in newspapers and magazines. He went to Kansas for a while and thought that he would have a sheep ranch, or a ranch anyway, and he didn't know what he was doing, and he lost all his money. And so he opened a saloon for a while. Anyway, none of that worked, and he went back home. He was from New York. And he realized that, no, my heart is with the cavalry out west, and that's where the money is, too, because when I paint these pictures and they reproduce them, that's how I make my living. And he was the highest paid illustrator in America. And this is a published image, actually, after a pastel of a trooper here in the same series called Bunch of Buckskins, published in 1902. Owen Wister wrote an introduction to it. Theodore Roosevelt loved Owen Wister and loved Remington. And I think Theodore Roosevelt wrote something in the front of this, too. Remington almost always has somebody on a horse or with a horse or involved with a horse. And he always said when he dies, when I die, I want him to put on my gravestone, he knew the horse. That's all he cared about. And here's a Northwest Mountie. And I was trying to think of how many pictures I've ever seen of his that didn't have a horse in them, and not very many. Somebody said, this isn't original with me, but they said, you know, Remington was out there. He went with the army in the Spanish-American War, earlier out just on the frontier in the Indian Wars. He painted, what is it, Men with the Bark On. His idea of the West and his image of the Western man was a solitary, masculine, no nonsense, nothing civilized about him particularly. The only he deals with nature, nothing too soft. And that's something to know, because you look at all of these pictures and you think he's different than Charlie Russell, he's different than some of the others. But he thought, no, I'm painting this ideal that I have of self-reliance, independence, and of course he did it all in very realistic terms. This is the water hole. I should have said that. They come to the water hole and there's no water in it. Happy thought. But this is not a romanticized horse. That's an old, scrawny, starving, beat-up horse. The man is nothing. There's nothing handsome about the man. He thought of the West as only for the rugged individual. Now, at the time that he painted, the West was gone. It was right at the very end. And so he was really reflecting back with a nostalgia that's still with us, because he's very convincing in what he painted and what he sculpted. And the art world didn't pay any attention to him at all until he started casting bronzes. And suddenly they all began to look at him again and decide, you know, this guy's more than just an illustrator. Look at that. And he did a whole series of bronze before he died in 1909, in his 40s, had appendicitis. And I don't know, because I've seen all of them, and I don't know if anybody ever surpassed him in capturing movement, energy, life in dead metal. And he really did. And another one, a contemporary of his, the same time, now we're into the remembering the good old days, was Frank Tenney Johnson. And he's famous for his nighttime scenes, his moonlight scenes. But Remington started that. He did a lot of moonlight scenes. In fact, they call them nocturnes. Now, I happened to, it's been 7 or 8 years ago now, someone I know wanted to do a show of Remington's nocturnes. And he was in an Eastern museum, and his contemporaries and his colleagues just thought that was a horrid idea. You couldn't have a show on Remington. Well, and he said, have you ever seen any of his pictures? Well, no, but isn't he one of those Western artists? And so this person got together with all these slides of all these nocturnes, and they said, he painted nocturnes. And so that was agreeable to their, oh, well, I guess it's all right then. And so they did this show of his night scenes, which was really quite a good show. It traveled all over the country. And I know the only bad review that he's ever gotten that I know of, we did a show in New York of Carl Bodmer's work, and that is when I was at Joslin, and got good reviews. I did have a reviewer come saying, I was ready to really bomb this show. which I thought was kind of a bad way to come to a show. But he said, well, oh, you've just done wonderfully. And I think it was because it came from Omaha. He thought, well, what do they know in Omaha? But anyway, this same guy hated Remington. And because he didn't paint women, of course there weren't any out where he was, and he had a poor attitude toward the American Indian, which is true. But I thought, how funny, he didn't like Remington. It has nothing to do with his art. He didn't like the man. But I guess that's a fair... Anyway, and William R. Lee's another New York artist who went out west and fell in love with it and painted hundreds and hundreds of Western scenes and did a book called The Western Pony. There's a big collection of his work at Gilcrease in Tulsa, and also some big paintings that he did at Woolaroc near Bartlesville, Oklahoma. Here's the idea of the bucking blind. This is called a double crosser. And it's a typical hyped up kind of scene. Boy, that horse has bucked him off for sure. And he hasn't even hit the ground yet. But he was another of the narrative artists. All of his pictures have stories to tell. And that is true of most Western art. Here's Charlie Russell. I mentioned him. This is a watercolor. He was there. He grew up out in the West, in Montana, and spent most of his life in Montana, although he didn't die till 1926. So much of what he paints is looking back. You should look across there. There's the buffalo herd down by the, you can see it down there. And he worked as a cowboy for some time. He was actually, they always called him the cowboy painter. Actually, he was a painter who happened to be a cowboy at one point. And Montana, when we first went to Montana, I stepped out of the car and went into some place in Bozeman or Billings, and almost the first thing that somebody said to me was, what do you think of Charlie Russell? And I thought, just the way they said it, I thought, I better like him, I bet. And so I said, oh, I think he's wonderful. And that took care of that. But I thought, what if I had said, oh, he is really a, you know, something, I might not have got out of there, I don't know. But that's one of the first things they asked me. There's Charlie Russell in all his sweetness and romance. And he depicted the Native American very differently than Remington, with great sympathy. And he did a lot of bronzes too, and I don't have any pictures of them, but they were little. He did what we call desk pieces. He just did them for fun. The other illustrator, who's just now come back in favor in the last 20 years, is N.C. Wyeth. He's the father of Andrew Wyeth. And I had a director, and earlier than that, somebody I knew in university, who just hated the Wyeths. Just hated them. And I always thought, why? You know, because it's so dumb. I don't hate any of the, you know. And I thought, with the director I knew, I thought, oh, he just learned that in school. He wouldn't know of N.C. Wyeth if he saw one. But anyway, N.C. Wyeth, in his day, was the highest paid illustrator in the country. And he illustrated many, many of the classics, the Scribner classics and that kind of thing. He painted lots of murals. I used to know somebody who, when there was a little child, is Kay Cole, he painted, his dad, her dad had a lot of money. He painted a lovely mural over the fireplace in the children's house. The children had a little playhouse. And N.C. Wyeth painted a mural for the... But anyway, this was called Indian Warfare. It's an illustration, although I can't tell you for what. I like even better... Now, I should say, he was contemporary. He died in 1945. He went out west only as a very young man. You always have to say that so they can qualify as Western. He illustrated a lot of things. He illustrated pirates and everything else. He was never a pirate. And he was just really good at what he did. And of course, if any of you know his son Andrew, and then the grandson also is a painter. There, I always liked this. It's just called Outlaws. I don't know, again, what it illustrated. But he has a lot of energy and life in his works like Remington does. I mean, just you can practically smell a horse. And that's what I always felt of Moran's huge painting at Gilcrease of Shoshone Falls. I said, you really can't hear the water when you look at that thing. But anyway, that's what I felt about N.C. Wyeth. And then the whole group of people I haven't touched on in the Taos School. And Sharp, Joseph Henry Sharp, was one who worked for, he was actually out of Cincinnati, but he worked several winters in Montana and among the survivors of the Custer Battle of the Little Bighorn, and then later settled in Taos, New Mexico. And that's where he's best known as kind of the father of that whole group of Taos artists who eventually settled out there in that whole school. And Fritz Scholder is an American Indian, and that's his idea of the USA. And I thought, now he's a contemporary. He's brought forward, you know, the one thing that we got into when I was doing this encyclopedia of the American West was the role of the American Indian artist. And of course, I knew a lot of Indian artists growing up in Oklahoma. And I always said, just call them artists. Don't say they're Indian artists necessarily, unless that's what they paint. And some of them do and paint in the traditional manner. But like a good friend of mine, years ago now, Brummett Echo Hawk, and he worked for the Tulsa World, he didn't want to be, and he was 110% Pawnee, and he would go to the powwows, and he wasn't ashamed of being an Indian, but he didn't want to be classified in that way. He wanted people to look at his work for its own sake. And I always feel that way too. It's like when they have shows and they'll say, this is a show and all the people in it are women. And I think, does that make a difference in how I look at the art? What if they were all Chinese, one-legged, half-deaf Indian or women? You know, I mean, you can get into all these little things. And so I understood what he did not want to be classified. He did not want to be put into a slot. Fritz Scholder actually wasn't very much Indian anyway. I don't think he's any more than I am. But he was very famous for a while because he was kind of daring with his images and with his design. And so people either like him or they don't. I have to say that. Either people just think, oh, I love all his stuff, or they just hate it. I'm gonna close here because I have a whole nother videotape, and it's too long, and we'll be here till midnight. Let me do that. There. Does anybody have any questions, or is everybody ready to fall out of their chair?
Let's give David a round of applause here.
Thank you.
We do have time for a few questions, so if you have one, please raise your hand, and we'll be... Sissy has one, right?
I don't know what you'd ask.
Here, let's see, Bob G will hand you that microphone.
Thank you. You didn't mention Curtis, who is a photographer. Is he considered an artist also?
Oh, yes, I put him in the encyclopedia.
Oh,
Yeah, I did. Edward S. Curtis, his enormous production, started in the 1900, 1902, called The American Indian. And it's the biggest photo documentary of its kind ever produced to date. And you've all seen some of them reproduced somewhere.
Okay. Got a question right back here. Barry? Hold on, wait for the microphone, Barry. We need it for the recording.
One of my favorite shows I saw in the late 80s was Nikolai Fechin that you had over at the Gilcrease Museum. Can you speak about Fechin in the Taos area?
Well, he was one of the Taos painters, and there's a large collection, not so large at Gilcrease as there is at the Stark Museum of Art in Orange, Texas. That's where a big collection of Fechin is. Fechin was a Russian artist who went out to Taos for his health originally, and later went to California. But he was certainly a modern artist, and he loved to paint. and it was all about paint and painting. But he did remarkable portraits, I think. And again, Fession's one of those artists that you either really like his work or you don't at all, and I know people on both sides of it. I do like Fession's work. And they sent his remains back to Russia, and they had a big show there later, in the last 10 years.
Another question? Here's one right up here, Bob. We'll wait for the microphone, please.
Oh. I've been trying to research artists who signed by an initial, and I've done a lot of writing from hints I had about where it came from. Do you have any idea the best way to go about that? It's signed with a capital R inside a circle. I think I wrote Gilcrease some years back.
Well, the R inside a circle might indicate that it's a registered trademark.
Well, that was one thing that it was a suggestion that was with a Disney TV movie back in the 60s about a longhorn.
Yes.
Sancho the homing steer.
Yeah.
And I did call the archivist from Disney, and he said they didn't put that mark on original art.
Maybe what you're looking at is not original art.
Well, it looks like original art to me.
I was going to say, one thing you should always do, it's like with Charles Bird King or, well, anybody, is when you find something like that, take it to the nearest museum or collector just to find out what the medium is. That'll save you a lot of work.
It's either oil or acrylic, I think.
Okay. Well, then I don't know if it's acrylic, it's modern.
Well, would the 60s be modern?
Yes. I was alive in the 60s.
Okay, let's go to a next question here. We had one back here in the back. Someone had a question?
You mentioned a number of artists who worked in Europe more than in the United States, particularly Germany, and I wondered if they were, if you know much about German artists who were, I understand that there were many people, that there was a German fascination with cowboys and Indians. And
They still are.
Pardon?
Even today. Yeah, they still are. But a lot of the painters that we just looked at, and a lot of the artists in America studied in Europe, like Miller. He didn't study in Germany, he studied in France. Lee studied in Germany. Oh, a number of them, in Dusseldorf or one of those places where they all went to Europe at some point, if they didn't do anything more than take the grand tour, so that they were not unacquainted with what was going on in the art schools in Europe.
Okay, question here, John.
I just had a quick question. When the Thomas Moran and Turner, when the Gilcrease partnered with the Philbrook,
Yes.
and that was put together,
Yes.
one of the most fabulous shows ever and
Was it?
educational.
Yes.
I drove a Suburban with 10 of us in it, and to the day and back. Were you there? Did you put that show
No,
together?
I knew about it, and I knew the people involved with it, but I wasn't there. I was in Omaha.
Is there any possibility of that ever happening again at
Oh,
the
I don't know,
Gilcrease?
because the director at that time, later was the director in Omaha, and then now he's in, gosh, Pennsylvania somewhere, Allentown. So if they do it, he won't do it, but I don't know, that took a lot of effort. I bet they don't do it again soon.
Some of y'all may remember when the Clinton Library opened, the Arkansas Art Center did an exhibit called The Art of the Presidents. And they brought art that presidents had brought with them to the White House.
Yes,
And Ronald Reagan had a collection of Western art.
yes, I bet he did.
That he brought with him. And
Yes,
that
because
was,
he was, yes.
that was on display. Let's give David a round of applause.
Thank you.